Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second shelf. Today is the 8th, yes, the 8th of December, and I just realized this morning that I never filmed a November tops and flops. Sorry about that. So, a little bit belated. I'm going to film this today. And for those of you who might be new, my monthly tops and flops is just what the title says. I look at my reading of the previous month, and then I pick a couple of books that I think are tops and a couple of books that are flops that I was disappointed in or whatever. So, December 8th, finally, my November tops and flops. And as always, we start with the tops. And as always, within the tops, we start with the best reread of the month because, as you know, 2019, one of the goals was to reread more. And for this month's best reread, I picked Virginia Woolf's 1929 essay, A Room of One's Own, which I read together with KayB. I leave a link to her channel down below. Please check her out if you are not subscribed yet. This is an essay that was written after Virginia Woolf gave 2 lectures on the theme women and fiction. So in this essay, she tries to answer the question, what do women need in order to write fiction? She looks back at history when you have in your bookcase the first fiction written by women. And it's not a straightforward essay in the sense that there is a non-fiction argument. She makes an argument, of course, but Virginia Woolf, in her own way, employs fiction. So she talks about a woman going to university, trying to get into the library. She talks about luncheons. She talks about dinners. And she talks about this woman looking at her bookcase, trying to find fiction by women. So it's a very own Virginia Woolf's very own way to approach this subject. And of course, many of you will know the central thesis of this essay is that women do need financial independence and a room of their own, a room where they can write, where they are not disturbed. And as an example that really stuck with me, she talks about Jane Austen and how Jane Austen would hide her writing whenever somebody would come into her room, and that Jane Austen was really happy that there was a creaking floorboard just before the door to her room, so she could hear the creak that somebody would come, and then she could hide the book. Terry and I both had read this essay when we were really young, which is for both of us. Sorry, Terry, if this is too much information, but for both of us is quite some time ago. And it was really interesting to reread it when you are quite a bit older. The things that I remembered from this essay, and some things I didn't, most of them I didn't. So it was interesting to see what I did remember and what I didn't, and how I approach this essay now that I'm so much older than when I first read it. It's really interesting. It's an interesting read. It's an engaging read, and you can discuss with the author, as it were, whether you agree with the arguments that she makes. So for me, it was a really interesting, illuminating reread. I will also leave a link to another review down below. Brian from Bookish read this book also, I think in October, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, I'll leave a link to his review down below. So if you want to have, a different take on the book, you can check out his channel. You should check out his channel anyway, but you could also check out his review of Virginia Woolf's essay. Next up in the tops category is the book that surprised me the most. And I always, in this category, pick a book that I read or start reading with trepidations, like I'm probably not gonna like this very much, and then the book surprises me, as it happens. Not always, but sometimes. And November Surprise was a fantasy novel, Naomi Novik's His Majesty's Dragon, the first in a series, the Temeraire series. And I think in the US, the book is called Temeraire. I read this, it was another buddy read. I read this with Chris from Chris Bookish Cauldron. And I will it's Sunday. I'm not able to make whole sentences. I will leave a link to his review down below. If you're following me, you know me and fantasy. I try to get into fantasy, to try to find something that I like. I really enjoyed N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series, but most of the straightforward R.R. Martin type of fantasy is just not really for me. So when I read the blurb of this book, you know, dragons and all that, I thought, yeah, well, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a delightful book. It's historical fiction fantasy set in during the Napoleonic Wars from the perspective of the British. So in, you know, the early 19th century when Britain and France fought the Napoleonic Wars. So it has this familiar historical setting, and there is one twist. The fantasy twist is that there is also aerial combat fought by people on dragons. So we follow our main character, Lawrence, who is a captain, a naval captain, and he finds a dragon egg, and then, to circumstances that are explained in the book, he has to be the master, by want of a better word, of this dragon, and then he has to go to aerial school to learn how to fly and to combat. So that is the main story, and then we follow these two, Lawrence and his dragon, whom he called Temeraire, during battles, but also the development of their relationship. And I have to say, I love this book so much. I thought it was such a delight, mainly because of the character of Temeraire. That was so well done to really engage me with this strange creature that doesn't exist in the real world, that it was an absolute delight. I also realized one thing, and by the way, Chris loved the book as well, so his review that I linked down below is also a raving review. And one thing that I realized reading this book is that one of the difficulties that I have with fantasy, or two difficulties that I have with your, regular fantasy, is the world building often bores me. And in this case, you didn't have this extensive world building because it was a world that is familiar to us. It was just set in the past. And the other thing is that often fantasies are series, like this one is also a series, but this one is different in the sense that the book has its own plot that is finalized when you finish the book, so you don't have to read on. And I think that is one of the things that I have to keep in mind when choosing fantasy, that I don't want to commit to a 10-book series. I just want to read one book and be finished with it at the end without having, this cliffhangers, so that I have to read the second and the third and the fourth. So that is something that I also learned from reading His Majesty's Dragon. If you're into fantasy and you haven't read it, it's really, really a delight. And the third and final book in the tops category is the book that I thought about the most, and that was without any doubt Katharina Vermette's novel The Break, first published in 2016. Katharina Vermette is a Canadian author of Métis descent, and the novel is set in a Métis community in Canada. and it centers around the violent attack of 2 young girls, one of which is raped. The story is told from various perspectives. The 2 young girls' perspective, but also the mother, the aunt, other family members. There is a group of young women around 16, 17, one of which is called Phoenix, and she's sort of a gang leader. So part of it is from her perspective. We learn about her past, how she came to be, who she turned out to be. And we learn quite early on who attacked the 2 girls after they went to a party without their parents knowing. So the attack happened on the way home. But we also have 2 police officers, one of which is white, one, and the younger one is also from Métis descent. So it gives me, at least as a reader who knows shamefully little about this particular group of Indigenous Canadian people, a look into the community, and the message, if you want to call it that, of the book is the women are really the most important part. The men are kind of, absent a lot of the time, except for the police officers. So I thought the story was, it's not an easy book to read. I had to, read it in smaller portions. The violence is explicit, but it is also done in a way that was not, that you have this idea, it's just for the effect, for the shock effect. Not at all. It's really quietly done, if that is the right word, and the impact that this violent incident also had on the family, the mother, the grandmother, the aunts. So I thought it was beautifully written also. I read this book, by the way, I don't know whether I mentioned that, another Buddyread together with KayB, who doesn't have a channel, unfortunately, but I'm sure if you are a booktuber or if you comment regularly, you will always see her in the comment fields, because she's a regular watcher, viewer, and commenter. And we both thought it was a really very good book, gritty, that's for sure, and the topic is not something that we had difficulty when we discussed. You can't really say I enjoyed the book, because the story is not enjoyable at all, but it is a really, really brilliant book. So if you have, like me, I've never read Katharina Vermette. This was my first, and I think she mainly writes children's fiction, so I don't know. I hope that she will publish adult fiction in the future, and I will certainly read it. But if you haven't read The Break, it's highly recommended. Please read it. Not easy, but important. So these were my 3 top picks for November, and on to the flops. I had quite a good reading month, so there were not that many books to pick from for the flops category, but there were a couple of disappointments. And the first one is a non-fiction book that was a recent release, Susanna Cahalan's book, The Great Pretender. It came out end of October, beginning of November. I read Susanna Cahalan's previous book, a memoir called Brain on Fire, about her ordeal in psychiatry when she was misdiagnosed. And I loved that book. I thought it was brilliant. So when I saw that she published a new book also about psychiatry, this time centering about pretenders, a 1970s experiment when a Stanford professor, David Rosenhan, and 7 other people had themselves committed to psychiatric clinics claiming to hear voices. And once in the clinic, they had to convince the doctors and the staff that they were actually mentally healthy and get released. And when the paper was published, it made an enormous impact on psychiatry, especially because it tackled the question whether psychiatry is a science that can actually distinguish between mentally ill people and mentally healthy people, and the long story short answer is no, it can't. So I thought that was an interesting topic, psychiatry, and why this book was a bit of a disappointment. Spoiler alert. It gave the impression from the blurb and from the marketing approach that Susanna Cahalan did research on this experiment and came up with all new insights about this experiment, and that this experiment might not have been as important or valid as it seemed. Well, to spoil you, she didn't. And that was my problem with the book. She gave also really interesting and engaging history of psychiatry from the beginning, when people were exposed to all kinds of horrible treatments, from electroshocks to water treatment to lobotomy. That part was really brilliant. But the fact that she also included research that, in my opinion, in the end didn't lead anywhere, made this book a bit of a disappointment. It's still worth your while if you're interested in the history of psychiatry, but don't be fooled into this marketing idea that the gist of the book is new insights into the Rosenhan experiment, because it just isn't. The biggest disappointment of the month was a book by an author who is beloved all over the world, and it's just not for me, obviously. And that is Jessie Burton's new book, The Confession, which also was a new release, I think, in November. Jessie Burton is famous for her previous book, The Miniaturist and The Muse. The Miniaturist set in Amsterdam. I have never read her, so I wanted to try this new author reading her new release, and it was just absolutely not for me. The book irked me from start to finish. So if you love Jessie Burton, you probably should stop watching now. The book is set in two timelines. One is in the 1980s, centering around the friendship between a famous to-be writer, Constance, who is moving to Hollywood because her book is made into a movie, and her friend from school, Elise, who wants to be part of this glittery world of fame, and in the end follows Constance to Los Angeles. So the 1980s plot is about these two women, and the other timeline plot is 3 decades later, when Elise's daughter, Rose, looks for clues about her mother, who vanished when Rose was a baby. And it turned out that Constance, the writer from the other timeline, was the last person to see Elise. So Rose tries to find out what happened to her mother by sort of wiggling her way into Constance's life, who is now an old woman. I didn't like the writing. I thought the writing was quite clunky. To be honest, very clunky. I thought the characters were extremely flimsy. You know, these kind of characters that have sort of one trait that is their trademark trait, and they have no layers, no nuance, nothing. And the plot, you know me, I'm a plot-oriented person. The plot was just horrible. It was so badly done, in my view. It was predictable. It had all these twists, these coincidences that were really, I have to move it, sorry, the unbelievable. And yeah, the only conclusion I can draw is that Jessie Burton, as beloved as her books might be, is her books and her writing is just not for me. I'm sorry about that, but here you go. Anyway, these were my tops and flops belated for the month of November. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, I'm looking forward to talking to you in the comments, and I'll see you all soon in the next one. Bye-bye.